If you're looking for alternative homes, you've come to the right place. In this video, we've rounded up 10 different alternative housing ideas, including Earthships, float homes, natural buildings, tiny homes, and more. Plus, we share some pros and cons about each one. We've been exploring and filming alternative homes for close to 10 years now, and we've seen hundreds of incredible and unique spaces, so we have a lot to share. Before jumping in, we just want to quickly mention that alternative housing for us is anything that's a little bit different. For example, it might be a different building technique, material, or size. It's also important to know that alternative housing is often off the beaten path, and the housing options might not be possible everywhere or work for every budget or climate, so it's important to do lots of research before jumping into anything headfirst. There are so many different places and different ways to live in this world that it can be a bit overwhelming to choose just one. Some really good advice that we got during our exploring is that it's helpful to get clear on what the main goal is, whether it's affordability, personal health, environmental sustainability, quality of life, etc., and use that knowledge as a guide. So now let's get started with number 1, tiny houses on wheels. Tiny houses on wheels have been growing in popularity over the past decade and can be a more affordable housing option than a traditional home, especially if you're able to build it yourself. They're built on trailers and can range in size quite a bit. For example, the smallest one we've seen was only 16 feet long by 8.5 feet wide, and the biggest one was 43 feet long by 10.5 feet wide. But on average, they seem to be around 300 to 400 square feet on the inside, especially when you include the loft spaces. One of the main advantages of a tiny house is the portability. Since they're built on wheels, they can easily be moved around and relocated. Another really cool thing about tiny homes is that because they're so small, a lot more time and effort can go into customizing and designing them into beautiful and functional spaces. But a few important challenges to keep in mind with tiny houses is that depending on the location, it can be hard to find a place to park them legally and to get things like financing and house insurance, so lots of research is required beforehand. Number 2, yurts. Yurts are probably the cheapest and simplest housing type on this list. Yurts, which are also called ger in Mongolia, originate in Central Asia and are basically portable tent structures made with natural materials. Traditional yurts have a round shape that makes them wind resistant, and they're built with several layers. The frame is built with wood lattice walls and roof rafters that are attached to central support poles and a dome at the top. They're insulated with several layers of sheep wool felt and are covered with a canvas cover on the outside for weatherproofing. Some North American made yurts use different materials like PVC for the covers, Reflectix for insulation, and they might even add windows or connect several yurts together. Yurts make incredibly beautiful homes, and there's just something very special about being in a round structure that's hard to describe, but it's quite calming. They can be set up really quickly, usually in just a day, and they have a low impact on the land around them. But they aren't suited for all climates, and it's often better if they're lived in full-time to maintain the space above freezing, to manage humidity, to make sure there are no leaks, and to prevent critters from getting in. Number 3, boats. Boats come in all shapes and sizes, and we've seen many people make cozy homes out of sailboats, narrowboats, houseboats, and more. Boat prices vary wildly from free derelict boats all the way up to more expensive brand new boats, so there are lots of options at different price ranges. Some liveaboards like to keep their boats docked at a marina and rarely take them out in open water. Being at a marina full-time is definitely more expensive than anchoring out, but it can make boat life quite comfortable with services like electricity, water, and internet right at the dock. Other liveaboards spend very little time at marinas and are on their boats to travel. Sailboats are a better option for open ocean, houseboats can be great on lakes, and narrowboats are an option for places with canal networks like the UK, France, and Amsterdam. Living on a boat means you have a waterfront home and all the benefits that come with that, but depending on the location, it can be tricky to find a marina that accepts year-round liveaboards, so it's always a good idea to find a dock before buying a boat. Some other challenges we've heard about boat life in general are that boats are expensive to maintain, hence the acronym Break Out Another 1,000, and that living on a boat means you're more exposed and vulnerable to the elements like extreme temperatures and storms. Number 4, shipping container homes. Shipping container homes are popping up around the world, but as we've seen in the comments on our videos, they can be very polarizing. Some people love them and some people kind of hate them. But it's easy to see why they've captured people's imaginations with all the different possibilities of building with these modular containers, like stacking and cantilevering them in lots of different unique ways. Shipping containers come in many different sizes, ranging from 10 feet long all the way to 53 feet long, and they can be 8.5 or 9.5 feet tall. They're often purchased used after a single one-way trip. Most people don't like to buy containers that have been used more than once because it's hard to find out if the container transported dangerous goods. A couple things that are important to get right when building with containers is making sure the insulation and ventilation are installed properly to prevent condensation issues, and making sure that the seams where the containers are joined are properly waterproofed to prevent any leaks. Number 5, float homes. Float homes are built like traditional homes, except that instead of sitting on a foundation on land, they're built on a floating base, and usually it's made of concrete and styrofoam. Float homes are often found in coastal cities and towns that have mild weather like Vancouver and Seattle, although we've also seen some in places like Toronto where they use bubblers to prevent the water from freezing around the house in the winter. Living on the water in a float home is absolutely picturesque, and a side bonus is that it can sometimes cost less than traditional homes and condos in the same area, probably in part because there's no land ownership involved. Another perk to float homes is being able to hop in a kayak right from your front door. But like most alternative housing options, float homes are not perfect. For example, they can have some extra fun maintenance tasks like regularly emptying out a septic tank. It can also be difficult to find a marina that has space for float homes, or that will lease the space for more than a couple of years at a time, which can be stressful. Number 6, Earthships. Earthships have to be one of the more beautiful, ambitious, and labor-intensive types of alternative homes that we've seen people build. The goal with an Earthship is that the home would be completely self-sufficient in terms of its inputs and outputs. The concept and design came from Michael Reynolds, who's an architect in New Mexico. They're built using waste products like old tires, bottles and pop cans, and natural materials like dirt to minimize the need for new materials. And they're designed to be heated and cooled using passive solar, to collect rainwater from the roof, to generate electricity from solar and wind, to grow food in indoor gardens, and to treat wastewater on site. They're incredibly impressive spaces, and Earthships have been built all over the world. The waste materials used to build Earthships can be quite inexpensive, but the real expense comes in the form of land, and especially labor, because they can take months and even years to build. We've seen a mix of official Earthships that were built using plans from Michael Reynolds, and we've also seen DIY versions where people come up with their own designs. It does seem like it's quite important to get the details right to ensure that the systems function the way they're supposed to, so it's probably worth it to purchase plans. And to make sure that the design is appropriate for the climate where it's going to be built, an energy modeler can help figure this out. Number 7, natural buildings. Natural buildings are built with materials that you can find in nature. Things like wood, sand, clay, straw, hemp, and stone. A lot of folks we've met like to use natural materials when they build, if they're trying to avoid using man-made products that might be harmful to human health and to the environment. Things like concrete, plastic, and products that contain VOCs. A good example of a natural building technique would be cob. Cob is a type of earth building that uses a mix of sand, clay, and straw to sculpt thick, sturdy walls. Sometimes they're load-bearing walls, and sometimes the cob is used to build walls inside a timber frame structure. Hempcrete is another natural building material that we've loved learning about over the years. It's made with hemp hurd, which is the woody part of the hemp plant, and lime to create a mixture that can either be made into blocks for later use, or to build walls on site by pouring it into forms. These are just a couple examples, but there's all sorts of fascinating natural building techniques out there like straw bale, rammed earth, and log homes to name a few. Natural materials can also be used in the finishing elements of a home, for example using natural plasters instead of drywall or cork flooring instead of vinyl, etc. Homes that are built using natural materials are often quite unique and will probably require custom design and engineering plans to make sure they meet the local building code. Number 8. Passive houses. Passive house is a building standard that aims to drastically reduce the energy required to heat and cool a home, sometimes by up to 90% or more, which is huge. Some of the design elements in a passive house are thick walls with lots of insulation, a very tight building envelope, triple glazed windows that are oriented according to the sun, and a heat recovery ventilation system that brings in fresh air and preheats it with the stale air that's being exhausted, which minimizes heat loss. A lot of people are concerned that passive homes will be unhealthy to live in because they're so tightly sealed, and think it'll be kind of like living inside a plastic bag. But the reality is that most non-passive homes also have a plastic vapor barrier. The difference is that with a passive house, the ventilation system is there to ensure that the home always has fresh air coming in. Of all the housing alternatives we've seen over the years, passive house seems to be the option that's the easiest to build just about anywhere because it's built with standard construction materials and because the design usually exceeds the building code requirements. It also has the most impressive and measurable impact on energy consumption. Number 9. Converted vehicles and trailers. Over the past 10 years, we've met many people living in all types of vans, vehicles, and trailers, like self-built camper vans, converted school buses, and renovated Airstream trailers. There are lots of reasons why people live in vehicles and trailers. Sometimes it's to travel, sometimes it's out of necessity, and sometimes it might be a choice to spend less money on rent. Whatever the reason, it's always fascinating to see the innovative ways that people find to make a home in small mobile spaces. From really simple, low-tech conversions to elaborate builds with all the modern conveniences. In terms of where people do this, some folks park for free on city streets and move around every night, or most nights. Other people might travel around to find free campsites on Crown land and BLM land. And there's also the option of having more of a home base by renting a seasonal site at a campground or by paying to park on someone's land. Living in a van or vehicle full-time is doable, but it's definitely not for everyone, and it comes with its own set of challenges. It's not as easy or as cheap as it might seem. A vehicle needs insurance, gas, and lots of repairs and maintenance, especially if it's an older model. It can also be challenging to find places to park for the night and to handle very hot or very cold weather. And finally, with number 10, small spaces. Small spaces might seem like a vague category of alternative housing, but small living spaces are one of the common threads between all of the alternative housing ideas we've shared so far. Living in any small space can be beneficial in a lot of different ways. It might be more affordable than a bigger space, or use less energy to heat and cool it, and a small space also needs less furniture and things like that, so it cuts down on spending and consumption in that way too. Many of the alternative housing ideas we've talked about so far are easier to find outside the city, but for people who want to live in an urban area, there are loads of small spaces like apartments, condos, and small houses that can be found in the city, which might also mean better access to jobs, public transit, and other social opportunities. As we progress through life, we tend to continue to outgrow spaces and move into bigger and bigger spaces. but choosing to stay in a smaller space or downsizing to a smaller space is an alternative housing option as well. Small spaces are definitely more challenging to live in and require constant work to make sure that the space remains functional and doesn't get cluttered, but there's something really satisfying about optimizing a small space to make it just right. And regardless of the type of home, keeping it small and simple can increase quality of life in many different ways.